Hello there! Today I'm here to bring you the first half of my July reading. I'm going to say here, I'm not going to go into details because I don't think it's really the place, but I've had some personal issues this half of the month which have meant that my reading has been really scattered. So I'm going to try and be as concise as I can about these books, but my feelings and my thoughts are all over the place and have been all over the place for at least the past week and a half or so because of what's been going on. So if my reviews of these aren't as in-depth or concise as I usually would, then I'm sorry. That's, you know, it can't be helped at the minute. But before all of that happened, I read The Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan. Now this is a short story collection which I was really glad to finally pick up. I wanted to read this for a long time, but also it's been so long since I've read a short story collection. Now Kirsty Logan's first short story collection, The Rental Heart, has some fantastic stories in that I return to time and again. The Rental Heart in particular is a personal favourite of mine, so I was really excited to get to this. Originally this was released in, I'm sure you've seen, a beautiful hardcover edition, and there was only 1,000 copies. Since the success of that, they have released it in this beautiful paperback which also has these lovely French flaps and just is stunning. I don't know what it is about Kirsty Logan, but all of her books are just so beautifully produced. She just seems to attract these really beautiful designers. So this is a collection of short stories which are kind of interweaved with an ongoing narrative, and we get snippets of this narrative in between each of the stories. The narrative is basically about these two women who are having a baby together, and they've made a promise that they won't tell this baby any lies, which includes stories, because stories are made up things. But both of them, when the other one is asleep or out of the house or whatever, both of them tell this baby stories in secret, and it's difficult because I like that interweaving theme. I think it makes a short story collection much more accessible to much more people if there is that thread going throughout. However, I don't think it actually added anything, and I don't think it worked, because these stories don't read as though they have been written with that narrative in mind. I may be wrong, but it read very much to me as though these stories were written and then kind of put together and that narrative was placed on top of them. So actually the women are sort of talking to the child and saying, this is a story about this, or this is a personal story about this, and actually I couldn't relate the story to what the woman was saying. And it is a criticism that I've heard of this book, is that the interweaving kind of doesn't fit with the stories, and I would definitely agree with that. Ultimately, I didn't think I was enjoying this when I was reading it, but actually when I think back, I enjoyed more stories than I didn't enjoy. There was one called The Perfect Wife, which I really enjoyed, which was about a woman who's absolutely besotted, and kind of the damage that being absolutely obsessed with your husband can do. The Exact Sound of Grief was really lovely. Flinch was really lovely. There were a lot of nice stories in here. To be honest, thinking back, I can't really remember many of them, but as I said, that might be because of where my head's been at and all the mess and stuff, and so this book feels quite far away for me, even though it obviously wasn't. So there is that, but ultimately, as I say, when I finished it and I thought back, there were more stories that I enjoyed in here than stories that I didn't, so I would recommend it. Then I read Beyond Black by Hilary Mantel. Now this was going to be my non-booktube book for the month, however I think I'm going to read another non-booktube book because I read this during a very difficult time, and my thoughts on it are completely skewed by what happened, and my reading slowed up. It took me 2 weeks to read this, and it's not a thick book, and that is unheard of for me, and I find that the longer I take to read a book, the more boring I find it, and it just starts to drag in my mind and become a chore. So I don't think it's fair to do a separate review of this or really push my opinions when, to be honest, they're not really true reflections of the story, I don't think. But I'm going to do a quick overview of it here. So this predominantly follows a medium called Alison and her assistant slash business partner Colette, and we basically follow their quite strange and harmful relationship, or working relationship. They end up moving in together, and kind of very much dictating what the other can do, and it gets quite harmful and unhealthy at times. And predominantly we're looking at Alison, who is kind of dealing with a lot of bad stuff that happened to her in her past and a lot of bad people, and obviously as a medium she's finding that a lot of those bad people are now coming through, and it's kind of unravelling her, and we get snippets of what happened and why she's becoming so insecure and worried about these characters coming through. Ultimately this started really strong for me, and I would say, as always, Hilary Mantel's writing was so powerful and she's just a fantastic writer. However, I think this was double the length it needed to be. I mean, it's not thick, it's only about 400 pages, 450, but it just really drags, especially in the middle, I think. There's a section when Alison and Colette move into a house together, and to be honest, the medium stuff completely goes away. Like, it's fun when they're on tour and Alison is giving her medium talks and talking to the audience and stuff, and it's really interesting. But then in the middle it just completely slows down, and I just got a bit bored. I lost my focus with it. Admittedly, it did pick it up again at the end a slight bit for me, but as I say, I think it could have been cut to half the size. Also, there is a problem with shifting points of view in this. It's not always clear who's talking when, because we do jump between Colette and Alison with kind of no real purpose or rhyme or reason to it. And also I would say that the timeline in this is really confusing, because I think over the course of the book we look at about 7 years of their working relationship together, but it's not clear at times how long they've been together, what time frame we're in. The sort of pivotal moment in their relationship is when Princess Diana dies, which is just after they've got together, and we then jump forward 7 years, but you don't really get told that. So throughout the book you're kind of thinking, are we just after Princess Diana has died? Have they just got together in this working relationship? The timeline was really quite scruffily done. Ultimately this was not the best. It was a 3-star for me. I was a bit disappointed, but as I say, I can't be 100% sure that's the fault of the book, so it's a difficult one. Ultimately though, I think if it was more gripping and more together for me, I would have been more inclined to read it regardless. But as it was, I just had no inclination to pick it up. I wasn't in the headspace, but also it just wasn't gripping me enough, sadly. So that was that one. Then a book that I've kind of been delving in and out of in the past month or so, which is Zen in the Art of Writing by Ray Bradbury. Now please ignore the fact that this looks like some disastrous early 90s school textbook. All of the copies of this book seem to be quite hideous, but anyway, regardless of that, this is a fantastic collection of essays which Ray Bradbury wrote for various different publications about his writing processes. I adore Ray Bradbury, and there are a few interviews with him on YouTube as well, which I really love watching, because I think a lot of the time writers take themselves very seriously. We can be quite serious people, you know, quite deep and dark and doomful sometimes, but Ray Bradbury is such a breath of fresh air, because he is a writer who purely wrote for the fun of it. You know, he was like a kid who was exploring with words and telling himself stories and having just absolute fun. He had such vivacious energy, and it really comes across in these essays. I think if you're feeling kind of down with your writing and uninspired, I think this is a fantastic essay collection to read, because it puts the life and the fun back into writing. It just reminds you that ultimately you're just having fun, just play, just have fun with words. I'd say that Ray Bradbury has written some of the best books in sort of recent classic terms ever, so you know, it works for him, and I think it is really just a breath of fresh air. He's such a fun and interesting person to hear speak, and yeah, he really just reignites your energy with writing, so I would highly recommend this if any writers are out there. And I also wanted to mention, I haven't read this in full because I did read it at the end of last year, but the paperback version of The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jane Campbell came out last week. Her and Two Roads very kindly sent me a copy of this, and I have been rereading a few of the stories, and I just wanted to talk about it because it is a fantastic collection, and I think if you haven't read it, you really should. There are some fantastic stories in here, and I think what's great is that there's something in here for everyone. There are realism-y short stories, there are magical realism-y short stories, there are stories that play with fairy tales, though they're not fairy tale retellings. There are stories which discuss disabilities, and there's just something for everybody, and I would highly recommend. It's strange because when I read this the first time, I would have said that Margaret Mary and the End of the World, I think it's called, was my favourite, but actually in hindsight, looking back and reading it again and reading out a few of the stories, the one that really stuck with me is Animals. It's the first story in the collection and is about a world in which you can buy a heart online. So you buy an animal heart online and kind of use it as a replacement, and it just, I think that's such a strong concept, and it's something that really fascinated me at the time, but I didn't know if it would be a favourite. But definitely looking back and rereading, it's the one that really stuck with me. But yeah, there are just all sorts of stories in this collection. There is one called Joseph, which is written from the perspective of a young boy questioning a lot of the things that he doesn't understand. At the beginning of the world in the middle of the night, the title story is written as a sort of, it's dialogue only, so it's kind of written like a script. And again, that involves kind of questioning the things that we see and the things that we assume we know, and it does get quite philosophical at times, but in the best way. And I just, yeah, read it if you haven't already. It's really fascinating, and I would highly recommend. Oh, and by the way, it's beautiful. Can you see that? Can you? It's stunning. Yeah, so yes, those are all the books that I have read / dabbled in so far this month. As I say, it's not been the best, but we're moving onwards and upwards. I'm really hoping to get stuck back in for the coming weeks of the month. I'm feeling the craving at the moment to just pick up books and devour them, which I haven't had in a very long time. So I'm looking forward to reading some more things and hopefully having a little bit more interesting things to tell you about them as well. So yes, please let me know down below what you've been reading so far this month, and I will see you next time. Bye!